He thought he understood racism until he lived it. Many white Americans in the Jim Crow era claimed they understood racism. They said they saw it. They said they opposed it. They said they knew how bad it was. One journalist decided that wasn't enough. He didn't want secondhand accounts or polite explanations. He wanted to experience the system the way Black Americans were forced to live it every day. So he altered his body, changed how the world saw him, and knowingly put his safety at risk. What followed wasn't subtle. It wasn't symbolic. It was immediate and relentless. The moment his appearance changed, his treatment changed. Where he could go, how he was spoken to, whether he was seen as human at all, everything shifted overnight. Racism wasn't hidden. It was enforced, constantly. What shocked him most wasn't just the violence. It was how normal it all was, how routine the cruelty felt, how the system didn't need explanation or justification to function. He thought he understood racism before. Living it showed him how completely wrong that assumption was. He thought he understood racism until he lived it. The man at the center of this story was John Howard Griffin, a white journalist, author, and devout Catholic who believed moral opposition to racism meant very little without evidence. He wasn't chasing attention, he wasn't staging a stunt, and he wasn't trying to prove he was one of the good ones. His goal wasn't sympathy or praise, it was documentation. Griffin wanted to understand how racism actually worked on the ground, not as an abstract idea, not as a headline, but as a daily system that shaped where people could go, how they were treated, and whether they were safe. He wanted to experience the mechanics of it, moment by moment, interaction by interaction. That distinction matters. This wasn't about pretending to be Black. It was about exposing how quickly the system activates once race is assigned. Griffin understood that observation from the outside had limits. To understand Jim Crow honestly, he believed he had to enter it and live under its rules. What he discovered wasn't about intent or personal prejudice. It was about how the system enforced itself, automatically, efficiently, and without apology. Griffin didn't use makeup or costume. He altered his body. Under medical supervision, he used medication that affected skin pigmentation and combined it with prolonged UV exposure to darken his skin. To avoid visible contrast that could expose him, he shaved his head. The goal wasn't performance, it was plausibility. He then traveled alone through the Deep South. No handlers, no protection, no public announcement. The people he encountered had no idea this was an experiment. To them, he was simply a Black man moving through a rigidly segregated society. That decision mattered. Announcing the experiment would have changed how people behaved. Griffin wanted unfiltered reality, not reactions to a headline. So he kept it quiet and lived under the same uncertainty Black Americans face daily. This wasn't disguise. It was immersion under real risk. Once his appearance changed, he surrendered control over how the world treated him. Griffin entered the Deep South in the late 1950s, when segregation wasn't just social, it was enforced. Jim Crow wasn't a set of attitudes floating in the air. It was a system backed by law, custom, violence, and economic punishment. Segregation told people where they could sit, eat, sleep, work, and rest. Customs reinforced it when laws didn't. Violence waited in the background when rules were challenged. And economic punishment made survival conditional on compliance. Step out of line, and you could lose a job, housing, or access to basic services. Racism wasn't abstract or hidden. It showed up in everyday interactions. Strangers enforced it without hesitation. Clerks, police, employers, and passersby all played a role. No coordination was required. Everyone knew the rules. This was the environment Griffin walked into. Not a moment of heightened tension, not a crisis, just the routine operation of a racial system designed to remind Black people, constantly, of their place. The shift was instant. The same spaces Griffin could move through freely the day before became hostile overnight. He was denied access to restrooms and drinking water. Businesses refused to serve him. People followed him, questioned him, and treated his presence as suspicious by default. The hostility wasn't always loud, but it was constant. Some encounters carried sexual threats. Others were marked by open contempt or quiet menace. Even neutral interactions felt dangerous because they could turn without warning. What struck Griffin most was how ordinary this behavior was. No one needed instructions. White strangers who had been polite or indifferent before now became aggressive, dismissive, or openly hostile. The only thing that had changed was how he was seen. Race functioned as a total social filter. It determined where he could stand, how long he could linger, and whether he was treated as a person or a problem. The system didn't require explanation. It activated on sight, and it did so everywhere he went. What shocked Griffin most wasn't a single violent incident. It was how casual the cruelty was. Racism didn't always announce itself with shouting or fists. It showed up in glances, tone, proximity, and silence. It was embedded in everyday behavior, enforced without emotion, as if this was simply how things were supposed to work. He became aware of constant surveillance. Eyes followed him in stores. People monitored where he stood, how long he stayed, and who he spoke to. Even standing still felt like a provocation. Existing in public required calculation. Fear began to structure every decision. Where to stand so he wouldn't draw attention. When to speak so he wouldn't sound out of place. When to leave before a situation escalated. Ordinary choices turned into risk assessments. That's what stayed with him. Racism wasn't just moments of violence or open hostility. It was the exhaustion of living inside a system that never let you relax, never let you forget your vulnerability, and never stopped watching. Eventually, Griffin returned to being white. He could step out of the danger, the surveillance, and the constant calculation. Black Americans could not. That contrast stayed with him. The ability to exit the experience exposed something fundamental about racial hierarchy. Whiteness came with reversibility. Safety could be reclaimed. Identity could be restored. The system allowed him an escape it never offered the people he had temporarily lived among. That realization carried a psychological cost. Griffin wrote about guilt and disorientation, about how impossible it felt to return to ordinary life, knowing what he now understood firsthand. He also described a sense of moral obligation. Once you see how the system operates up close, neutrality becomes a choice, not an accident. The asymmetry mattered more than the experiment itself. His experience had an end date. For Black Americans, the system he encountered had no exit. That difference, more than anything else, revealed how power and privilege actually functioned. After the experiment ended, Griffin documented everything he experienced in Black Like Me. The book wasn't written to entertain. It was written as a record, a first-hand account of how racism functioned when no one thought they were being observed. The response was immediate and intense. The book sparked national debate and forced many white readers to confront realities they had previously dismissed or minimized. For others, it was seen as an accusation rather than an exposure. In some places, the book was banned outright. In others, it was publicly condemned as dangerous or inflammatory. Griffin didn't just face criticism. He received death threats. His safety was compromised to the point that he was forced to leave his home temporarily. The reaction to the book revealed another layer of the system. Documenting racism was treated as more threatening than racism itself. Telling the truth disrupted comfort, and that disruption came with consequences. This experiment was never meant to prove that racism was real. Black Americans already knew that. They didn't need confirmation, validation, or documentation to understand the system they were forced to live under. It also didn't replicate lifelong racial trauma. Griffin could leave. He had an endpoint. He didn't grow up under the weight of generational exclusion, nor did he carry the accumulated psychological toll of navigating racism from birth. But what the experiment did reveal was how fast the system works. The moment race was assigned, hierarchy enforced itself. No instructions were given, no coordination was required. Institutions, strangers, and social norms all responded automatically. That speed matters because it exposes racism as structural rather than personal. This wasn't about individual prejudice or bad attitudes. It was about how law, custom, fear, and power combined to produce predictable outcomes. Griffin didn't uncover something hidden. He showed how openly the system functioned once you were placed on the wrong side of it. That distinction is critical. Racism isn't sustained by ignorance alone. It's sustained by systems that don't need belief to operate. This story still matters because the arguments haven't changed. Today, lived experience is still questioned. People are still asked to prove discrimination as if it only exists when it's caught on camera or documented in a report. Structural racism is still dismissed as perception, misunderstanding, or individual attitude rather than systemic design. Griffin's experiment cuts through that denial. It shows how fast identity shapes treatment and how little intent actually matters. People didn't need to hate him to enforce the system. They just followed the rules, spoken and unspoken, that were already in place. That's the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't require malice to cause harm. They require compliance. And when enough people comply, injustice becomes routine. The lesson here isn't about empathy or moral awakening. It's about evidence. Griffin didn't ask anyone to take his word for it. He documented how the system worked when it was allowed to operate uninterrupted. And what he exposed is still visible today, even if the language has changed. You shouldn't have to change your skin for the truth. Racism didn't need discovery. It needed acknowledgement. What shocked white audiences about Griffin's experience wasn't that racism existed. Black Americans had been saying that for generations. What made it real to many people was that it was documented by someone they were conditioned to trust. That's the uncomfortable part. The truth didn't change. The messenger did. The real question isn't what Griffin learned. It's why the truth had to be filtered through whiteness to be taken seriously. Why lived experience was dismissed until it came with credentials, notes, and a familiar face. You shouldn't have to change your skin for the truth to be believed. And yet, history shows that too often, acknowledgement only comes when injustice is translated into a language power is willing to hear. Thank you for tuning in to Leaving America Unfiltered. I'll see you next time.